Hello viewers, my name is Linda Manchegija, Curriculum Specialist in the OR Tambo Inland District. Today I'm going to present a lesson on the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and another subtopic that I'll be dealing with is assessment on the same content. Now, it is important that when we are talking about the Soviet Union, one, you know what I'm going to talk about. One, I'm going to talk about Mikhail Gorbachev. Going to talk about Gorbachev becoming a Soviet leader in 1985. Why did he introduce reforms? Reforms means changes. Perestroika and Glasnost, impact of the reforms. Now, when Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he was a general secretary of the Communist Party. And when he came to power, what he did was to support. He supported democratic reforms. Democratic reforms means that he wanted changes. Democratic reforms. Democratic reforms means changes that he believed in. Bear in mind that by that time, Russia was a very stubborn country which did not want reforms. And he was a different leader. He was not a hardliner communist like others in the past, like his predecessors. And he hoped to revive the economy with these reforms. He ended domination of the Eastern Europe by other countries. Eastern Europe basically was dominated by Soviet Union. He created friendly relations between the West and the East. Bear in mind that when he came to power, the relations between West and East were not cordial. They were not friendly whatsoever because of their political differences. Europe believed in communism, and that is Eastern Europe. Western Europe believed in capitalism. And those two different political ideas created enmity between these two countries. So America wanted to spread capitalism, and it also wanted to prevent the spread of communism. That created what is called Cold War. Now, what he did was to create friendly relations between these two countries, East and West. And he created friendly relations with Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was an American president. Why did he create friendly relations between himself and Reagan? It is because he wanted these two countries to work together, not to be enemies because of their different political ideologies. So by so doing, he helped end the Cold War. And in 1990, he received a Nobel Peace Prize. He received a Nobel Peace Prize for his leading role in the peace process in Europe. Now, that earned him a lot, because as a person who believed in the reforms, so it means he was prepared to make some changes in the Soviet Union. Now, he decided to initiate reforms, to start reforms. Why? Because the economy was poor. The Soviet economy was poor by that time, because large sums of money were spent in the development of its satellite states in Eastern Europe. You'll find that the financial resources of the Soviet Union were spent in developing other countries that are under Russia. Those countries were Eastern European states that believed in communism. So those countries now were using monies that were coming from Russia, leaving Russia bankrupt on the other side. Now, Soviet Union used much of its resources in the nuclear weapons. That is very unfair again. In arms race, in Afghanistan, in nuclear weapons. So when you want to know why the Russian economy was poor when Gorbachev came to power, you must note that it was because of Russia's involvement in producing nuclear weapons and military weapons. And secondly, it was because of Russia's involvement in the Afghanistan war and in the arms race. So the Soviet Union concentrated on the development of satellite states in Eastern Europe. Those Eastern European states were to be maintained by the Soviet Union. So monies were spent in the Afghanistan war, and monies were spent in the Afghanistan war. They were also spent mostly in the countries that were under him as a leader. So that is what happened when he came to power. The economy was very poor. Now, grade 12, that is what you must note, that everything that happened, it started from the country becoming very poor, the country becoming poor because of the way the monies were spent in that country. I want you to note that it was because of the way Soviet monies were spent. So then I want us now to look at the reforms that he introduced. The Soviet economy was poor because of Russia's involvement in the Afghanistan war and in the arms race, as well as in producing nuclear weapons. So what happened, and therefore, is that the economy was poor. When he came to power, Gorbachev, he wanted to sort of improve the Russian economy. So he introduced the reforms. One of the reforms that he introduced when he came to power was called Perestroika. Perestroika means restructuring the Soviet economy. Now, restructuring means changing, trying to make some changes in the economy. He reduced the Communist Party control of the economy. He did not want the economy of the country to be controlled by the Communist Party. He reformed the economy but not replace it with capitalism. Please, viewers, note that Mikhail Gorbachev never supported capitalism. He was a communist. He supported communism. When he was making changes in the economy, like introducing the Perestroika, that didn't mean he has decided to abandon his political ideology, which is communism. It's that he wanted to use some form of capitalism in order to boost communism. So, for instance, with the Perestroika, he allowed some small-scale private ownership of properties. Private businesses were allowed. Now I am explaining. I'm now explaining Perestroika. So when you're explaining Perestroika in your essay, please, you must be able to say that when Perestroika was introduced, private businesses were allowed. Business could make their own decisions about prices. Foreign investment was encouraged. That is very important. This is very important that Russia never traded with capitalist countries before. But when he came to power, Russia traded with capitalist countries, and there was also a foreign investment which was encouraged. By foreign investment, we mean that people from the West were allowed to come and invest in Russia by having their own businesses in Russia. So if foreign investors, even if they are from capitalist countries, were allowed in Russia. Western companies were encouraged to invest in the Soviet Union. State control of the economy was not allowed. The state should not, according to Gorbachev, be involved in the smooth running of the economy. So other political parties, other than the Communist Party, were allowed. Other than the Communist Party. Before he came to power, there was only one political party allowed in Russia. It was the Communist Party. So Russia was a unitary state or a one-party state. And as a result, there was a lot of dictatorship because there was only one political party that was dominating in that country. But when he came to power, the country became a multi-party state. He allowed other parties to exist. Now, Russia stopped to be a one-party state. The Perestroika, that is Perestroika. I want you viewers to be acquainted, please be familiar with the word Perestroika. Perestroika means restructuring of the economy. Now, that is one of his reforms that he introduced because he wanted to improve the economy. Now, Perestroika created political, social, economic tensions within the Soviet Union. Now, in other words, the reform called Perestroika had undesired consequences. It had undesired results. He had hoped that Perestroika going to be successful and improve the economy. But unfortunately, Perestroika led to the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. In other words, it led to the fall of the communist countries in Europe and the dissolution of the what we call the dissolution. It also led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, still on Perestroika, viewers, Perestroika, so please get used to the word Perestroika when you are talking about the downfall of the Soviet Union, because the main focus is on Perestroika and Glasnost, and those are Russian words. Perestroika means restructuring of the economy by allowing some elements of capitalism in order to boost communism. I think I phrased it correctly. Perestroika abandoned the concept of class struggle. Class struggle. Class struggle. That is very important. That as history learners, you must be familiar with the terms. Class struggle means priority of human interest over the interest of any other. This was abandoned. Before he came to power, class struggle was the most important thing in Russia. Gorbachev introduced the Sinatra Doctrine. Sinatra Doctrine, which was a Soviet foreign policy, which allowed members of the Warsaw Pact to determine their own affairs. Before he came to power, members of the Warsaw Pact were not allowed to determine their own affairs. Their own affairs were determined by the Soviet Union. But now he gave them autonomy to determine their own affairs. Gorbachev, as I've said too, Gorbachev allowed foreign investors to invest in the Soviet Union in order to revive the Soviet economy. He also introduced another reform. That reform was called Glasnost. Glasnost then means openness. Glasnost is a Russian word which means openness and transparency, which means openness and transparency. Glasnost. Now, in what? In government institutions, people must be able to explain what is happening in the government. Look at it. Glasnost was a commitment of his administration to allowing citizens to discuss the problems of their system and potential solutions. Now, what he did, Glasnost encouraged criticisms of the government. That is very important. That is very important. Allowed criticisms. When you are discussing this essay, there are main points that you must not miss when you're talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union. You must be able to say Glasnost encouraged criticisms of the government. This was for the first time that in Russia, the government would be criticized. In the past, before he came to power, his predecessors would never allow anybody in Russia to criticize the government. But this one, he said, no, people must be allowed to express themselves concerning how the government is run. He allowed freedom of speech. Before he came to power, there was no freedom of speech. You would be arrested for criticizing the government. And there was no freedom of the media. You can't just publish anything that is denting the image of the government. Now, what he did was, then he introduced Glasnost in order to Glasnost in order to normalize the relations with the West. So his concern was with the West. But everything, viewers, has got its consequences. Now I have explained what he did with his reforms. Now, in this subtopic, I want us to look, this is another subtopic, impact of the reforms on the Soviet Union. Now, this subtopic is going to be telling us about the impact of his reforms. He was too liberal. He was not a Chauvinist, a conservative. He was almost a very liberal communist. So, as a result, let's look at the consequences of his generosity, of his reforms, the changes that he made. One, his reforms had unintended, how shame, his reforms had unintended consequences of triggering unrest, So, which means that his reforms created unrest and disorder, which means people were not in favor of his reforms. They did not want changes. His reforms led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. That is very bad again. His reforms led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And his reforms again ended the domination of the Eastern Bloc by other countries. Now, there was very little political freedom and the economy remained stagnant. The economy did not improve. Now I'm explaining the consequences of his reform, the impact of Gorbachev's reforms on the Soviet Union. One, the economy did not improve. It remained stagnant. Political freedom was very little. Now, the reforms that he introduced ended in what is called Iron Curtain. Iron Curtain means separation. Iron Curtain, which separated Eastern Communist states and Western states. Now, that is what happened. Then again, his reforms, Gorbachev created friendly relations with the capitalist states. What made him to be an enemy of other communist members? It is because he created friendly relations with the capitalist states. Pure communists, the hardliners who were led by Boris Yeltsin, did not like friendly relationship with Western countries because Western countries were capitalist countries, states. So unfortunately, what made him to be unpopular, it is because of his generosity towards the Western countries. So what he did, therefore, he created a friendship with Ronald Reagan, who was an American president. By so doing, he ended the Cold War between West and East. Cold War means tension between East and West. Tension which is caused by political differences. In 1990, he received the Nobel Peace Prize. He received the Nobel Peace Prize for his leading role. Nobel Peace Prize for his leading role in the peace process. Economic weaknesses were the causes of the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Now, when again you look at the Soviet Union, what happened? I'm still on this subtopic, which is talking about the impact of the impact of the reforms on the Soviet Union. Now, the two reforms ended the entire system. I want to see this when you are discussing an essay. You must be able to say the two reforms ended the entire system of the Soviet Union. So, Perestroika and Glasnost ended the system of communism in that country. What happened to him? Shame. He lost support at home. Just imagine, you are a president. You don't have support at home. How would you lead people who do not want you? He lost support and he even became unpopular in the Communist Party. Now, his reforms led to the fall of the Berlin Wall. So when you are discussing an essay on the collapse of the Soviet Union, I need you to say something about the end of the entire system. I need you to talk something about the end or the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was caused by the reforms that were introduced by Gorbachev. And even the reunification of Germany in 1990 was one of the impact of what is called Gorbachev's reforms. The reforms led to, again, to collapse of communism. So the main points here, when you are talking about the reforms, one, you must be able to say it ended the entire system of the Soviet Union. Two, it became unpopular and lost support at home. Three, it led to a fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. It led to a reunification of Germany in 1990. it led to collapse of communism. So in your essay, you must make sure that these main phrases are part of your discussion. In each and every paragraph, I want to see the impact, like the fall of the Berlin Wall, Gorbachev becoming unpopular, ending the entire system, reforms leading to collapse of communism. So you have to be sure. One of the consequences, one of the impact of the reforms was that Poland demanded to be independent from the Soviet Union. And this had a domino effect. Domino effect means that other countries wanted to follow Poland in becoming independent from the Soviet Union. So when Gorbachev came to power and introduced reforms, other Eastern European states of communism did not want to be under the Soviet Union. Now, what happened was that when Poland became independent, other countries also demanded independence from the Soviet Union. Now, each of the 15 republics that were under Russia, Soviet Union, became independent. Just imagine, one of the impact is that 15 self-governing states or Soviet satellite states became independent. They fought to be independent from Russia. So viewers note that the reforms that were introduced by Gorbachev created turmoil, civil unrest. So you must note that. And again, if Baltic states demanded independence from USSR, Baltic states means self-governing states under the Soviet Union. And now Gorbachev had opponents in his country. That you must note, the hardline communists, that is the pure communists, did not want changes. As a result, they turned against him. And there were liberals who were for changes. Liberals wanted him to make changes, whilst hardlineists were against changes. There was that problem in his country. And again, then now, the hardline communists led by Boris Yeltsin were against changes. This is very important for you to note that old form of nationalism emerged in Russia and led to new demand for independence. So in your essay, I want you to talk something about the old form of nationalism. And then the total collapse of the Soviet Union took many in the West by surprise. Unfortunately, in August 1991, Boris Yeltsin led an attempted coup to overthrow Gorbachev. A coup which was not successful was led by Boris Yeltsin, who was also a very strong communist. Yeltsin led the hardliners. Hardliners are those who were against changes. In 1990, Soviet states under Boris Yeltsin declared independence. The Soviet Union was now dissolved officially in 1991. And on the 25th of December 1991, Gorbachev resigned. He decided to resign as a leader in Russia. Why? Because the reforms that he made had undesirable results. Now, the Soviet flag, which was then the Soviet flag was lowered from Kremlin. Kremlin means Russian parliament for the last time, and replaced with the tricolor flag. Boris Yeltsin became the new president of the Russian Federation. So, in other words, Gorbachev was replaced by Boris Yeltsin. In conclusion, it is clear indeed that Gorbachev's political and economic reforms led to the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the downfall. It also led to the downfall of the Soviet Union. Then, viewers, please note that when this essay is asked, it is phrased in this way. Here is an example of an essay, of an assessment. The policies introduced by Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union in the 1980s resulted in the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War in Europe. Critically discuss this statement. Use relevant historical evidence to support your line of argument. When you are answering this essay, 1, indicate the line of argument. 2, state reasons for choosing this line of argument. 3, give brief historical evidence. Then you go to board. I want to emphasize the main points that are needed when you are writing an essay. 1, here, after introduction, I've already explained how the introduction should look like. Then your second paragraph should be on Gorbachev's rise to power. The third one should be Gorbachev's reforms. which is Perestroika, Glasnost. Then the main core of the essay is the impact of the reforms on the Soviet Union, as I have explained them. Then in conclusion, restate the line of argument. 10 introduction into conclusion, sum it up briefly. Viewers, I'm asking you to subscribe to YouTube so that you can have an access to these video recording lessons. And if you need help, also contact me